What was recovered from the GoPro chest mount strapped to a missing backpacker on the North Carolina side of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park in October of 2019 is the kind of footage every Dogman researcher spends their career hoping to find and dreading they will be the one to verify. The camera was retrieved from a notch of laurel 4 miles north of Fontana Lake, in a stretch of country the National Park Service formally treats no differently than any other piece of backcountry, but that the rangers who have worked those districts for the last 20 years quietly route around when they can. The backpacker was never found. The camera was, and what it recorded in the last hours of its battery life is the reason a senior ranger with 26 years in the National Park Service walked off the job 6 years short of his pension. The footage exists. It is sitting on a hard drive in a small ranch house outside Maryville, Tennessee. It will probably never be released because the man who holds it understands what releasing it would do. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. The ranger asked that his real name not be used. We will call him Hal. Given what the Park Service did to him in the year after he filed his initial incident report, and given the financial stake he still has in his benefits package, that request was not optional. The investigation that drove him out of his career is technically still open. The case file is still active, and the colleagues who once trusted his field judgment now reference him, when they reference him at all, in the past tense. Hal joined the Park Service as a seasonal employee in the late 1980s, working summers at Cades Cove while finishing a degree at a state university in East Tennessee. He converted to permanent status in the early 90s. By the time he made his way over to the North Carolina side of the park, he had worked the Cades Cove, Elkmont, Greenbrier, and Cosby districts. He spent the better part of 3 decades in the backcountry. He knew the trail system the way some people know the streets of their hometown. He had coordinated more than 100 search and rescue operations across his career and personally led teams on roughly half of those. He had recovered 17 bodies from the park. He had also brought out 83 living people who would not have made it without him. When a hiker went missing in the Smokies, Hal was one of the 3 or 4 people the Park Service called first. His credentials were not abstract. He was certified in technical rope rescue, swift water rescue, and wilderness first aid at the responder level. He had completed the Federal Incident Command training that allowed him to coordinate multi-agency response across the Park Service, the state wildlife agencies, and the county sheriff departments that border the park. He could navigate by map and compass in conditions where GPS units failed. He had walked virtually every named trail in the park and many of the unnamed drainages that connect them. Within the SAR community in the southeastern United States, his name carried weight. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park covers just over 520,000 acres straddling the Tennessee and North Carolina border. It contains roughly 800 miles of maintained trail and 2,000 miles of streams. It receives more visitors than any other national park in the country, somewhere north of 12 million per year. The vast majority of the park's acreage is wilderness in the practical sense, if not the legal one. You can walk for a full day in the Smokies and not see another person if you choose your route correctly. The understory in summer is so dense with rhododendron and mountain laurel that you can lose visual contact with a person standing 15 feet away. The trees are tall, the hollows are deep, and there are places, particularly on the North Carolina side, where the topography and the vegetation combine to create dead zones that have swallowed people throughout the recorded history of the park. Hal worked the North Carolina districts for the last 12 years of his career. He was based out of the 20-mile area for a while, then moved to a station closer to Bryson City. The North Carolina side is generally regarded as the wilder side, fewer visitors. Longer drives between trailheads. More backcountry, less front country. The communities along the southern boundary of the park, places like Bryson City, Cherokee, and Robbinsville, are the kind of small towns where everyone knows everyone, and where the relationship between the park and the surrounding population is more complicated than most park visitors understand. Whole communities were displaced when the park was established in the 1930s. The road to nowhere outside Bryson City, the truncated highway that ends at a tunnel in the middle of the woods, is a monument to the broken promise the federal government made to the displaced communities after the old road they had relied on was flooded. People in those communities remember. The grief is generational. Among those communities and among the rangers who work the North Carolina side closely with them, there is a piece of country roughly 4 miles north of where Hazel Creek empties into Fontana Lake that has its own quiet reputation. Hazel Creek itself is a famous waterway known to fly fishermen across the country for its native trout. The community that once existed along Hazel Creek, the town of Proctor, was depopulated in the 1940s when the lake came in. The remains of the town are still there, slowly being absorbed back into the forest. You can hike up Hazel Creek today on the Lakeshore Trail and find old foundations, scattered glass, the occasional rusted piece of mining or logging equipment. The Bone Valley Drainage, a tributary that joins Hazel Creek from the north a few miles up from the lake, is even more remote. Bone Valley was the site of a logging camp in the early 20th century. The Ritter Lumber Company ran timber out of that drainage for years. Then the timber was gone, the camp closed, and the valley was left to recover. Bone Valley has a documented history that involves more than just logging. Cherokee oral tradition referenced this stretch of country in ways that the Eastern Band has been careful about sharing with outsiders for as long as anyone has been asking. The Cherokee word for wolf is waya, and the Anawaya, the Wolf Clan, was one of 7 traditional clans within the Cherokee Nation. The relationship between the Cherokee and wolves is documented in the historical record going back to the earliest European contact in the southern Appalachians. Wolves were treated with a respect that bordered on kinship. There were ceremonies for those rare situations when killing a wolf became necessary. What is less discussed in the published ethnographic record is that the same old people also understood that not everything walking the deep hollows of the southern Appalachians on 4 legs or 2 was simply a wolf. There were other beings that the elders did not discuss with researchers from the Smithsonian or the Bureau of American Ethnology. Beings whose existence was part of a body of knowledge that the Cherokee, having watched the consequences of sharing their other sacred knowledge with outsiders, declined to put on the record. Bone Valley is one of the places where that knowledge attaches to specific ground. Hal learned about the exclusion from the older rangers when he transferred to the North Carolina side. Nobody explained it formally. There was no document. There was no policy. There was just a quiet understanding, passed from senior rangers to junior rangers over coffee at the station, that you did not volunteer for solo patrols up Bone Valley, that you did not push backcountry permits for camping in that immediate area, and that when SAR operations involved the Hazel Creek drainage, you routed the search grid in ways that minimized time spent in the specific 32 acres north of where Bone Valley Creek joins the main stem of Hazel Creek. Hal was told this in his second week on the North Carolina side by a ranger nearing retirement, a man who had grown up in Robbinsville and whose grandfather had been part of the communities displaced by the lake. The older ranger did not elaborate beyond saying that some places in the park were better left to themselves and that this was one of them. Hal took the advice at face value. For 10 years, he had no reason to question it. Then in October of 2019, a permit was issued for a 4-day solo backpacking loop that included a campsite within a mile of the exclusion. The permit holder was a 34-year-old man from Asheville whose family asked we not use his real name when this story is told. We will call him Travis. He was an experienced backpacker. He had thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail in his late 20s. He had done multiple solo trips in the Smokies, in the Pisgah National Forest, and in the Nantahala. He worked as a graphic designer. He was married, no children. His wife described him to investigators as careful and methodical. He filed a detailed itinerary with her before every trip. He carried a satellite messenger device that sent check-in pings to her phone twice a day. He carried a GoPro Hero on a chest mount that he used to record sections of trail for a personal blog he had maintained for several years. Travis entered the park on a Thursday morning. He hiked in from the Lakeshore Trail trailhead near the road to nowhere. He sent his first satellite check-in that afternoon from a campsite along Forney Creek. He sent his second check-in Friday morning. He sent another Friday afternoon. The Friday afternoon ping placed him approximately 6 miles up the Lakeshore Trail from where he had started, near the confluence of Hazel Creek and the lake. Saturday morning, no check-in. Saturday afternoon, no check-in. By Saturday evening, his wife was concerned but not yet alarmed. He had occasionally missed pings when terrain interfered with the satellite link. By Sunday morning, with no contact in over 36 hours, she called the park dispatcher. The SAR operation activated Sunday afternoon. The initial response was standard, a 2-team deployment along the most likely route based on his filed itinerary. Hal was not on it. He was off that day doing yard work at his house outside Maryville. He got the call Sunday evening when the Sunday teams returned without finding any sign of Travis. The dispatcher requested Hal to come in Monday morning to coordinate the expanded search. Hal drove over to the park headquarters at first light Monday and was briefed by the incident commander on what they had so far. The picture was concerning. Travis had not been seen at any of the established campsites along his filed itinerary. His satellite messenger had stopped pinging entirely after Friday afternoon. Either the device had failed or the batteries had died, or he was in a location where the device could not get a signal out. The Smokies have multiple terrain pockets where satellite communication becomes unreliable, particularly in narrow drainages with steep walls. Hazel Creek itself, in some of its more constricted stretches, was one of those areas. Friday's last ping had placed Travis just below one of those constrictions. Hal looked at the map and understood what the picture suggested. Travis had moved up Hazel Creek from the lake into the increasingly remote upper drainage, and at some point past Friday afternoon he had either left the trail or stopped moving entirely. The expected route would have had him circling north and then east through campsites at Bone Valley, Cold Spring Gap, and back down Forney Creek to his starting trailhead. He should have been at the Bone Valley campsite Friday night. Hal's team deployed Monday morning by boat across Fontana Lake to the Hazel Creek embayment. They reached the trail and began moving up the drainage with a 4-person team and 2 trail dogs. The dogs picked up nothing definitive. Hazel Creek sees enough foot traffic that scent trails confuse easily. They reached the Bone Valley campsite by early afternoon. The site was empty. No tent. No fire ring activity in the past 48 hours by any visible sign. No evidence Travis had ever set up there. Hal radioed back to dispatch and recommended expanding the search grid into the Bone Valley drainage itself. Against the advice of the older ranger, he had taken his guidance from a decade earlier. The man who had passed that guidance was now retired and living in Florida. The new acting district supervisor was younger, less connected to the unwritten institutional knowledge, and authorized the expansion. Hal and his team moved up Bone Valley Creek Monday afternoon. The drainage is narrow and steep in places. The understory is dense with rhododendron in the lower stretches and transitions into beech and yellow birch as you climb. The temperature dropped as they gained elevation. There had been overnight frost the previous 2 nights. If Travis was injured and immobile somewhere in the drainage, he was in serious trouble. Hypothermia in the Smokies in October at elevation is a real risk. Hal pushed his team hard. They covered ground methodically, calling Travis's name at regular intervals, listening for any response. Around 3 in the afternoon, about 2.5 miles up the Bone Valley drainage from its junction with Hazel Creek, one of the team dogs alerted on a patch of laurel about 30 yards off the trail. The handler took the dog in. Hal followed. What the dog had found was the GoPro chest mount. The harness was on the ground, the camera still attached. The strap snapped cleanly in two as if the wearer had been pulled out of it forcibly. The camera was undamaged. The battery had run down hours or days earlier. There was no body. There was no pack. There was no other gear. There were no tracks visible in the leaf litter around the laurel, though laurel duff is poor substrate for tracks. Just the camera, sitting where it had fallen 30 yards off a trail where no reasonable person would have left it on purpose. Hal bagged the camera. He marked the location with GPS. He photographed the surrounding area. Then he made the call to dispatch that escalated the situation. He requested the next morning's search to include a forensic-trained ranger and additional personnel. He also requested they bring up the equipment to download what was on the GoPro card. The camera had been on the ground long enough that the battery was dead, but the SD card should have retained whatever had been recorded. The team continued searching Bone Valley until last light. They found nothing else. Hal made the decision to extract for the night rather than camp in the drainage. He had given orders many times over his career that the team would be sleeping at the search site to maximize the next day's coverage. He did not give that order Monday night. The team boated back across the lake and stayed in the bunk room at the Fontana Ranger Station. Hal did not sleep well. He told us in a phone conversation we had many months later that he kept turning over the position of the camera in his mind. None of it added up to anything that fit the standard scenarios. A hiker who fell would still be near his pack. A hiker who was attacked by a bear would have left a struggle scene with bear sign all around it. A hiker who got lost would have continued moving and likely still had his camera with him. The position of that GoPro in the laurel suggested it had been removed forcibly from a person who was no longer there to retrieve it. Tuesday morning, the team returned to Bone Valley with reinforcements. They expanded the grid. They found, over the course of the day, 3 additional items. A trekking pole snapped in half about 150 yards uphill from the GoPro location. The break was clean. Not the stress fracture you see when a pole is driven into rocky ground, but a perpendicular snap that suggested the pole had been bent across something. They found one of Travis's hiking boots about 300 yards beyond the broken pole, even deeper up the drainage and slightly off to the east. The boot was on its side in a patch of moss at the base of a yellow birch. The laces were still tied. And they found, near the boot, the first sign of blood. A spray pattern on the trunk of the birch tree about 5 feet off the ground, dark and crusted over from days of exposure to the open air. Hal made the call to bring in the forensic team. Tuesday night, the SAR operation was reclassified from missing person to suspected fatality, and the FBI was notified per standard protocol for any death suspected to involve foul play on federal land. Around 4:30 that Tuesday afternoon, before they extracted for the day, Hal heard something on the slope above them. The team had stopped for water near the spot where they had found the boot. The other rangers were talking quietly among themselves about the blood spray on the birch. Hal had stepped a few yards away from the group to look up the drainage with his binoculars. The slope above them rose steeply, climbed 200 feet through dense rhododendron and capped out on a small bench of harder ground before continuing upward. He was scanning the bench when the vocalization came down from somewhere along that bench, slightly to the east of where he was looking. It was low, sustained. It rose through a register that he could feel in his chest before he could place it with his ears. It lasted 3 or 4 seconds, then stopped. Then it came again, in a slightly different pitch, then a third time. Hal was a man who had spent 30 years in southeastern forests and had identified every common vocalization across the full range of native species. What he was hearing did not belong to any animal he knew. The other rangers looked at him. They had heard it too. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then one of the younger rangers asked what that was, and Hal said he did not know. And they packed up and extracted ahead of dark. Hal told us when we asked about that moment months later that the vocalization had not sounded random. It had sounded like a sentence. He could not say what the sentence meant, but it had structure, and it had been directed at them, and his body had known it before his mind could rationalize it. The footage on the GoPro card was downloaded Tuesday evening. The forensic ranger who handled the download was the only person in the room with Hal when they first watched what was on it. They sat in the back office of the Fontana Ranger Station, the door closed, with the recording playing on a department laptop. Hal described to us what he saw on that screen, and his description was precise in the way that only comes from a person who has been carrying something for years and has worn every detail down to its essential outline. The footage begins as Travis is moving up Bone Valley Creek on Friday afternoon. The chest mount angles slightly down, capturing the trail in front of him, his hiking poles entering and exiting the frame as he walks. The audio picks up his breathing, the sound of his boots on the trail, occasionally his voice as he narrates something for the blog post he was clearly intending to make. Travis is moving steadily uphill. The light is fading. He stops at one point and pans the camera by turning his torso, surveying the drainage around him. The forest is dense. The creek is audible to one side. He says something about the campsite being another mile up, and he hopes he beats full dark. He keeps moving. The first sound that does not belong comes some minutes later. Travis is still walking. The audio captures faintly a vocalization from somewhere off to the west, up the slope. It is the same kind of vocalization Hal would hear with his own ears days later. Low, sustained, carrying a register that does not belong to any documented species in the southern Appalachians. The Smokies have no breeding wolf population. The eastern cougar was declared extinct in 2011. The black bear is well documented and produces nothing remotely close to the sound the camera captured. Travis pauses on the trail. The camera angle stops moving. He says quietly, "What was that?" Then he continues walking. He picks up his pace. The sound returns about 3 minutes later. Closer this time. Travis stops again. The camera captures him turning his head, scanning the slope above him. He cannot see anything through the rhododendron. The audio picks up the sound a third time, and now the pitch has shifted. Lower at the start, higher at the end. Hal described it to us as the kind of vocalization that has shape to it. Travis pulls out his phone. The screen reflection is briefly visible at the edge of the camera frame. He is trying to send a satellite message. The signal does not connect. He starts walking faster. The camera shakes more. His breathing becomes audible and irregular. He is moving uphill at a pace that is closer to a jog. The trail in front of him is climbing through a stretch where the laurel closes in tight on both sides, leaving him with maybe 4 feet of visibility to either side and limited sight ahead. He stops abruptly. The camera angle pitches forward as he leans down or crouches. The audio captures only his breathing for several seconds. Then the rustling sound of something heavy moving through the rhododendron about 30 feet ahead of him. Not behind him. Ahead. Travis backs up. The camera angle is wrong now, swinging as he turns. He starts to descend the trail he just came up. He is moving fast. Within a few steps, he stops again. There is sound behind him now, too. The same kind of heavy movement through the underbrush. He is between 2 of them, on a trail with no good visibility in either direction, with the creek to his east and the steep slope rising sharply to his west. He goes off the trail. He pushes downslope toward the creek, fighting through the rhododendron. The camera captures branches whipping past, leaves slapping the lens. He falls at least once. The audio is chaos, his breathing, his cursing, the sounds of his body crashing through dense vegetation. Then, very briefly, the camera catches it. The angle was wrong, the motion blurred, the light fading. But the forensic ranger paused the playback at the moment Hal first saw it, and they sat there in the back office and looked at the still image for a long time. What the camera caught, in the brief instant the chest mount happened to be pointed in the right direction at the right angle, was a figure standing in the rhododendron about 15 yards from Travis. Upright. The head profile was canine, with an elongated muzzle extending forward from the skull. The ears were pointed and erect. The shoulders were broad. The arms hung longer than human proportions. The fur was dark, almost black in the failing light, with what appeared to be lighter coloration on the lower jaw and throat. The eyes, caught in the residual light from the sky overhead, reflected back a pale amber. The figure was not moving. It was standing perfectly still, watching Travis as he came down the slope toward it. The footage continues for another short interval after that. Travis sees what the camera saw. He makes a sound that Hal could not bring himself to describe to us in detail. He turns and tries to run. The camera angle tumbles. The audio captures impact. More vegetation, more crashing. And then the harness snaps. The chest mount detaches from his body. The camera lands in the laurel facing upward at an angle that captures only a small piece of canopy and sky. The audio continues for perhaps a minute longer. There is sound. There is movement. There is what may be a voice, and may be a vocalization, and maybe the two of them intermixed. Then the audio captures a wet, decisive sound that the forensic ranger refused to characterize in writing. Then there is silence. The camera continues recording the small patch of canopy until the battery dies several hours later. Hal and the forensic ranger watched the footage 3 times that night. Then they sat in the back office for a long time without speaking. Hal understood, before he said a word to anyone else, that the footage they had just watched was going to define the rest of his career and the rest of his life, and that the institutional response to it was going to be something other than a calm and methodical investigation into what had killed a backpacker in a national park. That was the end of Hal's first day with the footage. By the end of his second day, he had been removed from the case. The official reason for Hal's removal was conflict of interest. The acting district supervisor cited his involvement in the recovery of the camera as creating a procedural concern, since Hal was now technically a witness to evidence and could not therefore lead the search team that was processing the same evidence. That was the language used in the memorandum. The actual reason Hal understood within 24 hours was that the footage had been reviewed at the regional level, and the people reviewing it had decided that the case needed to be handled by personnel who had not yet seen what the GoPro recorded. He was reassigned to a desk position at the Sugarlands headquarters on the Tennessee side. He drove 45 minutes each way to a job that consisted of reviewing trail maintenance schedules and processing backcountry permit modifications. The search for Travis continued for 11 more days before being officially scaled back to a recovery operation, then suspended entirely. Travis was never found. No additional evidence beyond what Hal's team had collected in the first 3 days of the search ever surfaced. The case was officially classified as a presumed bear-related fatality, despite the absence of bear sign, bear scat, or any of the standard indicators of a bear-related death. The classification allowed the park administration to file the case under an existing category and move it through the institutional machinery without triggering the follow-up review that a more anomalous classification would have required. The forensic ranger who had downloaded the footage with Hal was transferred to a different park within 4 months. The two of them never had a private conversation again. Hal heard that the forensic ranger had been told that any further discussion of what he had seen on the GoPro card was grounds for termination. Hal did not need that warning delivered to him personally. He understood the rules. But before he was removed from the case, before the institutional silence settled over the file, Hal did one thing that would later cost him his job and probably save the evidence from disappearing. On the Tuesday evening when he and the forensic ranger first watched the footage after the third viewing, Hal excused himself to use the restroom. He took the laptop with him. He sat in the back of the ranger station bathroom with the door locked and copied the footage file to a personal USB drive he carried in his pocket. The transfer took about 4 minutes. He put the drive in his pocket, returned to the office, and handed the laptop back without saying anything. The forensic ranger never knew the copy had been made. The drive sat in a fireproof safe at Hal's house for almost a year. He did not look at it. He did not show it to anyone. He went to his desk job at Sugarlands every day. He ate lunch alone in his truck. He participated in nothing that involved the Bone Valley case. He kept his head down and waited to see what the institution would do. What the institution did was decide that Hal was a problem. He had not said anything publicly. He had not filed any formal complaint or whistleblower report. But his presence at Sugarlands made the older institutional personnel uncomfortable. Hal had seen the footage. The longer he was around, the greater the risk that he might intentionally or otherwise make trouble. The Park Service does not fire people who have not done anything wrong. Federal employment protections are too strong for that. What it does is make their lives quietly difficult until they make the decision to leave on their own. Hal was passed over for a promotion he had earned. His annual performance review, which had been consistently outstanding for over 2 decades, came back with new language about communication and team integration that he had never seen before. His supervisor began documenting minor procedural issues in his file. He was assigned to training rotations that took him away from the backcountry districts where his experience would have been most valuable. The message was unsubtle. He absorbed it. He thought about quitting more than once. What kept him going for the better part of a year was a stubborn unwillingness to give the people who were squeezing him the satisfaction of his resignation. What finally pushed him out was a phone call from Travis's wife. She had been calling the Park Service for over a year, trying to get a clear answer about what had happened to her husband. The official communications she received described a bear attack consistent with documented predation patterns in the southern Appalachians. She did not believe it. She knew her husband. She knew his experience. She knew that the gear pattern recovered from Bone Valley made no sense for a bear attack. She had read every account she could find of black bear fatalities in the southeastern United States, and none of them matched what investigators had described to her about the scene. She was a journalist by training. She had been pushing. She got Hal's name from somewhere. We were never told the specifics. She called him at his house in Maryville on a Saturday morning in late September of 2020. She asked him directly whether he had been on the team that found her husband's camera. He said yes. She asked whether he had reviewed the footage. He said yes. She asked what was on it. There was a long silence on the phone, and then Hal did the thing that ended his career. He told her what was on it. He did not give her the file. He did not describe it in terms specific enough to use as evidence. He simply told her in general language that the official explanation she had been given was not consistent with what the camera had recorded. He told her that her husband had been killed by an animal that was not a bear. He told her that the people who had reviewed the footage understood this and had chosen to classify the case in a way that allowed the institution to move past it. And he told her that he could not and would not say more. She thanked him. She hung up. She made other phone calls. She contacted a journalist she had worked with in her previous career, a man who had reported on environmental and federal land issues for a major regional newspaper. The journalist began making inquiries. Within a week, Hal's supervisor was calling him into the office. Within a month, Hal had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Within 2 months, he had been informed that the investigation had concluded he had violated his non-disclosure obligations as a federal employee, and that termination proceedings were being initiated. He resigned before they could fire him. The resignation preserved most of his retirement benefits, but at a reduced level that reflected his early exit. He walked out of the Sugarlands headquarters on a cold morning in December of 2020, with a single cardboard box of personal items and the knowledge that 26 years of his life had just ended. If you have hiked the Smokies, particularly the deep backcountry on the North Carolina side, you know the kind of country I am describing. The hollows that close in around you, the way the canopy filters the light, the way sound carries strangely in those drainages, particularly along the creeks where the water noise can mask everything within a 30-yard radius. Let me know in the comments if you have ever had anything unusual happen in the Hazel Creek or Forney Creek drainages, because the reports I have been collecting from the broader region over the last few years suggest the activity in those backcountry sections is more sustained than most people understand. The Travis case was not the first Dogman-related incident in the upper Hazel Creek and Bone Valley drainage. It was simply the first one in which physical evidence survived in a form that could not be entirely explained away. Hal spent the year of his administrative purgatory at Sugarlands between October 2019 and October 2020, doing what nobody had asked him to do. He began compiling on his own time a quiet review of the incident files that had passed through the Bryson City and 20 Mile Ranger stations over the previous 30 years. He had administrative access to those files through his role at Sugarlands. He was not authorized to review them for any particular purpose, but he was not unauthorized to access them either, and the distinction allowed him to do the work without triggering any internal alarms. What he found, distributed across 3 decades of routine reporting, was a pattern that nobody had ever assembled in one place because no individual incident was significant enough to warrant attention. A solo backpacker who reported being followed at night near Bone Valley in 1993 logged under wildlife encounter and never followed up. A backcountry ranger who described in a sick day request submitted in 2004 an unspecified medical issue that the documentation attributed to a stress reaction following an event in the Hazel Creek drainage. The ranger left the Park Service within 6 months. A pair of fly fishermen who reported finding what they described as a partial deer carcass in unusual condition along Bone Valley Creek in 2011 filed under wildlife observation. A solo hiker who was reported missing in 2015 recovered alive 2 days later, who refused to speak about what had happened during the missing interval and who left a partial statement about hearing sounds that did not match any known animal. That hiker's case file included a note that the witness had refused additional questioning on the advice of his attorney. None of these incidents taken individually would have raised concerns. Read together with Hal's eye for the geography and timing. They described a sustained pattern of Dogman activity in a specific drainage of the park, going back at least to the early 1990s and continuing through the present. The activity was nocturnal. It clustered in the warmer months. It involved at least one large bipedal predator with vocalizations distinct from any known native species, and it had produced a 30-year sequence of incidents that the park administration had managed by classifying each one under the lowest available wildlife category and moving on. The system had simply absorbed each event into the noise of routine backcountry operations. The eastern band of Cherokee Indians, whose Qualla boundary lies just south of the park, has its own institutional knowledge of this stretch of country. Hal reached out after he resigned to a contact he had developed over the years through joint cultural resources work between the park and the tribe. The contact was a man in his 60s who worked with the tribe's natural resources department and whose family had lived along the Oconaluftee for generations. Hal met him for coffee in Cherokee in the early spring of 2021 and described in general terms what he had found in the records. The contact listened. He did not interrupt. When Hal was finished, the man was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that Hal has thought about every week since. He said the old people had names for the beings in those hollows that the elders did not write down in any of the dictionaries the linguists made in the 1800s. The elders had been careful about what they shared with the linguists and the missionaries and the bureau agents who came through asking questions about Cherokee language and tradition. There were beings that the people respected and that the people did not name to outsiders because outsiders did not understand that naming a thing improperly was a way of disrespecting it, and disrespect had consequences that the outsiders would not believe until they experienced them. The contact did not give Hal any names. He simply confirmed that the beings existed, that the old people had known where to find them and where to avoid them, that Bone Valley was one of the places the old people had marked as territory belonging to something other than humans, and that the park's establishment in 1934 had not changed what lived in those hollows but only changed the human relationship to it. The contact also told Hal something he had not expected. He said the elders had a quiet understanding within the tribal community about the National Park Service's relationship to those parts of the park. They had observed, over the better part of a century, that certain incidents were handled in certain ways, that certain areas were quietly avoided by certain rangers, and that the institutional behavior of the park, while never explicitly acknowledging the beings the elders knew about, had nonetheless adapted around them. The contact described this as an unspoken treaty. The park did not name what was in Bone Valley. The beings in Bone Valley did not press the issue. The arrangement was unstable but functional. Travis's death had been a violation of the arrangement in a way that Hal's contact did not entirely understand. He said he suspected the violation had come from the human side, that something about the way Travis had moved through that country had crossed a line that the beings recognized. Hal did not press for more. He understood that the contact had told him as much as the contact was prepared to tell an outsider, even an outsider he had worked with and trusted for years. He thanked the man and drove home through Cherokee and over the mountain on Newfound Gap Road, watching the dark walls of the park rise on either side of him, thinking about what an unspoken treaty looks like from the inside. What sat heaviest on Hal was the silence around the footage itself. He had it on his hard drive. He had watched it half a dozen more times in the months since he resigned, each time understanding more about what the Dogman had done before Travis died. The structure of the vocalizations between the two creatures was clearer with repeated review. They had been communicating with each other while they herded Travis toward the slope. The figure the camera caught for a moment in the rhododendron had been standing in a position that suggested it had stopped intentionally to allow Travis to see it. The eye contact in the frame, the still image that Hal had isolated and stared at for hours over the course of that first winter, showed an animal that was not in attack posture. It was in display posture. It was letting Travis know what was about to happen. The deliberateness of the moment, the choice to stop and be seen, the recognition that the camera was recording was the part that did not match anything in the animal behavior literature Hal had spent his career studying. He understood, watching it back, that the Dogman in Bone Valley had wanted the footage to exist, that the creature had stopped, posed, and waited for the camera to catch it, that the killing had been carried out in a way that left the camera intact, that left it positioned to capture the small piece of canopy overhead, that allowed the evidence to survive precisely so that someone like Hal would eventually find it. The message in the footage was not the killing. The message was that the killing had been a choice, and that the documentation existed in the world now whether or not the institutions that received it knew what to do with it. That was the part that broke Hal. The violence he could have absorbed. The sheer impossibility of what he had seen he could have absorbed too, given enough time. What he could not absorb was the intelligence behind it. The cold calculation that had produced a piece of evidence with no other purpose than to be found by humans who were capable of understanding what it meant. The Dogman had known that the camera was recording. It had used the camera. It had killed Travis in a way that preserved the recording. And then it had let the body disappear into the drainage so thoroughly that no recovery team would ever find what was left of him. The footage was the message. The body was withheld so that the message would be the only thing the institution had to work with. And the institution had buried the message anyway, exactly as the Dogman had probably calculated they would. Hal's marriage came apart over the year and a half after his resignation. His wife, whose name was Marlene, had supported him through the Sugarlands assignment and the administrative leave and the resignation itself. She had believed him about the footage. She had not seen it, and Hal had decided he was not going to show it to her, but she had accepted what he had described to her. What she could not accept in the end was the way the knowledge changed him. She told him, in the conversation that ended the marriage, that she had married a man who knew how to come home from his job and leave the job at the door. The man who came back from Bone Valley was someone different. He did not sleep through the night. He kept the porch lights on. He had stopped going outside after sunset for any reason except to bring the dogs in. He spent hours in his office reviewing the footage and the incident files. He had become, in her description, a man who lived inside an experience that nobody else could enter. She loved him. She told him so. But she could not stay in the marriage as it had become. She moved out in the summer of 2021. They divorced amicably the following spring. She had moved to a small town in Southern Virginia. Hal stayed in the house outside Maryville. He sold most of his outdoor gear within a year of his resignation. The high-end backpacking equipment he had accumulated over a 30-year career, the technical climbing gear, the lightweight tents and stoves and water filtration systems, all of it went on the consignment racks at an outfitter in Knoxville. He kept a single day pack and a single pair of boots. He told himself he might use them for short walks near the house. He had not. The last time he had walked into a forest more substantial than the trees on his own 4-acre lot was the day he walked out of Bone Valley with the GoPro in an evidence bag. He had been a hunter his entire adult life. He grew up hunting whitetail and small game with his father in the foothills of East Tennessee. He had hunted every fall for 40 years, never missing a season. In the fall of 2020, the first season after Travis died, he did not buy a license. He has not bought one since. He keeps 2 rifles in a safe in the house, both of them his father's, neither of them used since his father died 10 years before all of this happened. He told us on one of our calls that he sometimes opens the safe and looks at them, and that the smell of the gun oil and the canvas case reminds him of country he no longer feels at home in. He closes the safe. He goes back to whatever he was doing before he opened it. What he was doing more and more was watching the footage. He estimated when we asked that he had watched the full sequence on the GoPro card more than 300 times. He had isolated individual frames. He had enhanced the audio. He had timed the vocalizations against the visible movements of Travis on the trail. He had built in a series of notebooks that he kept in the same fireproof safe as the drive, a behavioral analysis of the 2 creatures that was more detailed than any wildlife biology paper Hal had read on any large predator in North America. He had become the foremost expert on a single Dogman incident in a single drainage of a single national park. The expertise was useless. There was nobody he could share it with. The footage was contraband. If he tried to publish, he would face federal consequences for the unauthorized retention of the file. If he simply released it online, the content would be dismissed by every credible institution as a hoax. The footage exists in a kind of evidentiary limbo that no institutional framework can accommodate. It is too specific to be dismissed. It is too anomalous to be processed. So it sits. The intelligence question was the one Hal returned to constantly. The Dogman in Bone Valley had understood the camera. It had understood that Travis was wearing a chest mount and that the device was recording. It had paused in a position that allowed the recording to capture it. It had killed in a way that preserved the device. And it had done all of this in the context of a coordinated action with at least one other individual whose movements had herded Travis off the trail and into the position where the killing took place. The behavior implied not just intelligence but planning. It implied that the Dogmen had observed Travis from the moment he entered the upper drainage, that they had developed a strategy for engaging with him, and that they had calibrated the execution to leave a specific kind of evidence in a specific location. That level of behavior matches nothing in the conventional zoology of large North American predators. It matches the descriptions Linda Godfrey collected from witnesses across the Great Lakes states for 30 years. It matches what witnesses in Appalachia have been saying about these creatures for as long as Appalachia has had European settlement. The bipedal canine with the elongated muzzle and the pointed ears appears in regional accounts from the 1800s, in Eastern Cherokee oral tradition that goes back centuries before that, and in the modern sightings that have come out of the Cherokee, Pisgah, and Nantahala national forests over the last 50 years. What it does not match is anything the federal land management system is equipped to engage with. The Endangered Species Act has no provision for an undocumented apex predator. The National Park Service's wildlife management framework recognizes a finite list of species and assigns each one to a category. When evidence emerges of a species that does not fit any of those categories, the system has no procedure for handling it. The default response is to classify the evidence as something the system already recognizes and move on. There is no scenario in which the footage moves through the institution and produces an honest acknowledgement of what it shows. The institution is not equipped to produce that acknowledgement regardless of the integrity or intentions of the individuals within it. The structure determines the outcome. That structural reality is what makes the Dogman phenomenon so difficult to engage with at the institutional level. The evidence is not lacking. The witnesses are not lacking. What is lacking is any institutional vehicle for processing the evidence in a way that does not destroy the careers of the people who handle it. Hal understood this from the inside, after years of working within the Park Service, in a way that academic critics of institutional silence do not always understand. The silence is not malevolent. It is not coordinated. It is simply the natural output of a system whose components all have rational reasons to maintain the status quo. Nobody decided to bury the Bone Valley footage. The people who handled it simply made the individual choices that, taken together, produced the same outcome as a coordinated cover-up would have. The result is identical. The mechanism is more banal. Travis's wife, after her phone conversation with Hal, did not go public with what he had told her. She had the journalist contact she had reached out to. She had the moral standing of a widow whose husband had died under circumstances the official record did not accurately describe. She could have produced a major piece of investigative journalism. She did not. She told Hal in a follow-up call that she had thought about it for weeks and decided that going public would not bring her husband back, would generate a media circus that would consume her life, and would not produce the institutional accountability she initially imagined. She had decided to grieve privately. She thanked Hal for telling her the truth, and she told him that knowing what had really happened, even without being able to do anything about it, was preferable to continuing to live with the official lie. She moved to the West Coast within a year of her husband's death. Hal has not heard from her since. The Bone Valley exclusion is still in effect, though nobody calls it that. The 32 acres north of where Bone Valley Creek joins Hazel Creek are still part of the standard backcountry of the park. Backpacking permits are still available for the Bone Valley campsite and the surrounding area. The Park Service has made no public statement about the case that would discourage backpackers from using the drainage. But the unwritten institutional practice that Hal had been told about in his second week on the North Carolina side has intensified since 2019. Solo permits in the immediate area are processed with a series of unexplained delays. Ranger patrols through the drainage are scheduled in ways that minimize time on the ground. The acting district supervisor who authorized Hal's expansion of the search grid into Bone Valley was reassigned within 18 months of Travis's death. The replacement supervisor has reinstituted the older protocols. The exclusion holds. The system has rebalanced itself. The ethical question Hal turned over most often in the months after his resignation was whether the footage should ever be released. He had taken it from the Park Service without authorization. The legal exposure was real. But the deeper question was not legal. It was practical. If the footage went public, what would happen? The most likely scenario, Hal believed, was the one Travis's wife had also worried about: a media circus, national coverage of the Smokies, cryptid researchers descending on Hazel Creek with cameras and rifles, and the conviction that they were going to be the one to prove it, or to bag a specimen. The drainage would be overrun within a month. The creatures, whatever their actual numbers, would either retreat further into the backcountry or be drawn into confrontations that would end badly for everyone involved. The unspoken treaty would shatter. The institutional response would be an attempt to contain the public relations damage, which would mean classifying the footage as a hoax with as much institutional weight as possible and discrediting Hal personally. The footage would not produce understanding. It would produce noise. And the noise would make the Dogman in Bone Valley more dangerous, not less, by stripping away the careful boundaries that had been holding for 90 years. Hal also understood the counter-argument. People who walked into Bone Valley did not know what was there. They booked permits through a system that gave them no information about the elevated risk in that specific drainage. The Park Service was, in a real sense, allowing visitors to enter territory where they could be killed by an undocumented predator without any warning that the risk existed. That was an institutional failure with a body count. Travis was the most recent. He probably would not be the last. And the silence Hal was being asked to maintain was, in effect, complicity in whatever happened next. He sat with the question through the winter of 2021 and the spring of 2022. He drafted a long letter to the Regional Park Service office laying out everything he had found: the pattern in the historical reports, the geographic analysis, his own behavioral assessment of the creatures based on the footage. He never sent it. He wrote a draft article for an outdoor publication that he had a contact at, sanitized of the specific evidence but laying out the general argument that the park's backcountry permitting system needed to be reformed to provide visitors with more honest information about elevated risk in specific drainages. He never submitted it either. Every version of speaking out ended with the same outcome. He would be discredited. The footage would be branded a hoax. The drainage would still receive its visitors. And the next person who pushed too far into the upper Bone Valley would die in a place where the institutional record showed no elevated risk, with nobody to warn them and nobody to tell their family the truth afterward. He chose silence. He did not feel good about it. He told us in our last call that he understood why his Cherokee contact had described the situation as an unspoken treaty. The treaty was not only between the park and the Dogman, it was also between the people who knew and the people who did not. The knowing kept the not knowing safe by maintaining the boundaries that produced predictable outcomes. The cost was that some of the not knowing would die crossing lines they had not been told existed. The benefit was that more of them would live than would otherwise have been the case. The math was awful. It was also, as far as Hal could see, accurate. What Hal does know is that Bone Valley is still there. Hazel Creek is still there. The drainage is still receiving its annual flow of backpackers, fishermen, and day hikers. The trail is still maintained. The campsite is still on the reservation system. Most of the people who pass through that country will pass through it without incident, the way most people have passed through it for the better part of 90 years. A small number will not. Hal cannot do anything to change that. He understood on the day he walked out of Sugarlands for the last time that his ability to influence what happens in Bone Valley ended when he ceased to be the senior ranger whose word carried weight. He is now a private citizen with a hard drive and a notebook and a memory. He said one more thing in that last conversation we had with him that I have been turning over since. He said the Dogman in Bone Valley had not killed Travis because Travis was a threat. The Dogman had killed Travis because the killing produced a piece of evidence that would land in the institutional record and reinforce the boundaries the creatures had been maintaining for as long as the park had existed. The killing was an investment in the long-term territorial integrity of the population. Travis was, in that sense, a sacrifice to the system the Dogman had been operating for generations. A demonstration, a reminder, a reinforcement of the unspoken treaty that the Cherokee elders had described to Hal's contact in such careful language. Travis had crossed a line. The line had been redrawn in blood. The institution would absorb the redrawing and continue to maintain the boundaries the creatures wanted maintained. And the next backpacker who decided to push too far into the Bone Valley drainage would do so against a slightly more recent piece of institutional muscle memory that would keep him on the safer side of the line. The mountains do not care about any of it. The Smokies have been there for hundreds of millions of years. They have been the home of large predators throughout that span. The current population of dogmen in the upper Hazel Creek drainage is recent in geological terms, however old it is in human terms. The creatures have outlasted the Cherokee removal, the lumber boom, the establishment of the park, the construction of Fontana Dam, and 12 million annual visitors. They will outlast the current administrative structure of the park. They will outlast the current generation of rangers. They will outlast Hal and probably everyone who watches this. The hollows will still be there. The understory will still close in around anyone who chooses to walk into it. And in the deeper sections of the upper drainage where the laurel grows so dense that you can lose sight of a person 15 feet away, the dogman that paused in the rhododendron in October of 2019 and let a chest-mounted camera record its face will still be there, or its descendants will. The territory is theirs. The unspoken treaty holds. The footage exists. It will continue to exist for as long as Hal's drive continues to hold the file, which is probably longer than Hal himself will continue to exist. He has not decided what to do with it after he is gone. He has thought about leaving it to a research institution with explicit instructions for posthumous release. He has thought about destroying it. He has thought about doing nothing and letting whoever sorts through his belongings make their own decisions. He told us he does not yet know what the right choice is. He said he probably will not know until he is closer to the moment when the choice is no longer his to make. If you walk into Bone Valley, you do not walk in alone. You walk in with the knowledge that something is paying attention. Whether that something chooses to engage with you depends on factors that none of us, on the outside of the arrangement, fully understand. Hal did not understand them either. He understood only that Travis had crossed a line he himself was not aware of, that the consequences had been catastrophic for Travis and corrosive for everyone who had to process what was left, and that the line was still there and probably still in the same place. The trail is still maintained. The map shows the drainage as ordinary backcountry. The map is not wrong. It is simply incomplete. There are layers to that country that the map does not show, and the institution that maintains the map has no protocol for adding. The layers are real. They are why Hal keeps his porch lights on. They are why a senior ranger left his career 6 years early. They are why a backpacker from Asheville never came home. And every October, when the temperatures drop and the leaves start to turn and the high country gets its first frost, Hal sits on his porch in the evening and watches the dark line of the foothills to the south, knowing that beyond those foothills the Smokies are doing what they have always done, and that in one specific drainage of one specific section of one specific park, something that should not be possible by any model of the natural world he was trained to understand, is still walking the same trails it was walking the night Travis took the wrong turn into a piece of country whose true ownership was never his to challenge. The Dogman is still there. The territory is still theirs. The footage is still on the drive. And the unspoken treaty broken once in October of 2019 has long since healed over and resumed its quiet operation, the way the forest itself heals over the wounds of human passage and continues to be what it has always been.